Tonight, my superintendent's report is specific to the Pathway Forward reopening. The board has asked a number of questions. Our community has asked a number of questions, and so tonight is really being responsive to those questions that the board has provided, as well as information that we want to make sure that we share with you tonight to be able to update you around some of the work that's been going on and information that you've requested. When I thought about this report, it brought me back to really a year ago. It was February 29th, early Saturday morning, when I got a phone call from Dr. Jane Stavum, our superintendent. And she let me know that later that day, that tragically the first COVID-related death would be announced, and it occurred in Kirkland, the first COVID death in the United States. And since that time, nothing has been typical, and everyone's life has been turned upside down. Tonight we heard comment about lives being turned upside down. We see that throughout our communities, and I can't help but recognize the impact that this has had on everyone's life, and schools are part of the solution. And so I recognize that and appreciate that. On Friday, I provided a message related to our decision, the considerations. Tonight, both Matt and Mike will provide further detail regarding the questions around the evaluation, the considerations, the implications about our decision, and communication related to secondary schools. Based on our evaluation, multiple factors, the decision was made, and I know that decision does not resonate with everyone. We also, the board has, I know it does resonate with many as well. That is what is so complex about the scenario that we are in. And so I want to recognize the complexity of just the divisive nature of so many of these decisions that we have to make as a school district and truly as a community. And so I want to recognize that as well. I also want to recognize that given all the sets of facts, that there are times that people would come to a different conclusion than we did. And so I also want to recognize that, the challenge with that, and what that brings with it. And so tonight's presentation will provide the board with an update related to the questions that you have brought forward. Additionally, I want to provide some comments, brought some things prepared around bargaining. You asked questions around the educational services in our region, so I brought some information around that. I also reached out to all of our secondary administrators to find out what is the provision of in-person services right now on your campuses, just so that we can understand the baseline that we're operating from. Some information about the 21-22 planning and what that looks like, and some of the other players that actually play a role in that decision-making process as we are working through it. And then brief comments around 2021 graduation. And so have that information for you as well. I want to start by just broadly talking about bargaining. The national narrative related to unions has been very consistent. And so I think anytime we think about issues on the national level, but then bring them back to the local level, they always aren't the same story. And I think that's important to know as well. We have a good working relationship with all of our unions. That's not just the Lake Washington Education Association, but all of our union groups. And we've had to work with our union groups throughout the entire time. And so through those negotiation processes, we've had to amend the collective bargaining agreements. And we call those letters of understanding here in Lake Washington. And so we've gone through processes and procedures with our unions. Primarily, we've done those negotiations with Lake Washington Education Association. Just in the last year, we have negotiated a number of letters of understanding. Between May and August, of last year, we negotiated a letter of understanding related to remote learning. Between July and August, we negotiated a letter of understanding related to special education programs and services. Between September and January, we negotiated the kindergarten and first grade return to in-person learning, all of the working conditions associated with that. And I want to pause there because that's the longest duration of time for any of these letters of understanding. And that truly was related to how do you provide instructional services for our youngest learners in these environments. And so for those that were on the bargaining processes, those were emotional conversations, those were difficult conversations, yet we truly have a collaborative relationship with our Lake Washington Education Association. So it was coming from a problem-solving stance. Did it take a long time? Absolutely. But I think we have one of the best results in the region. When I look around at all of the letters of understanding, our K1 letter of understanding is outstanding. Between December and January, we negotiated the elementary special education and special services letter of understanding, given the transition for our elementary learners. Our second through fifth grade letter of understanding negotiated from January through March. That will be finalized most likely this week. And then our secondary in-person support learning model, we are currently in negotiations around that. And so I just wanted to provide that update. We have literally been at the bargaining table for the last year. So some of your questions have been around what are the educational services that are being provided within the region. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to start with when I think about the educational services that are occurring here in King County. The public health efforts in our county is directed by Seattle-King County Public Health. I continue to refer to them as King County Public Health, even though that actually shortens their name. And so King County Public Health and other health departments have truly approached this pandemic and the guidance related to K-12 schools significantly different. We've seen this even in the face of the Department of Health's decision tree, the guidance that was provided in August, and then again updated in December. An important tool for all of us to be able to reference is the OSPI weekly data tracking tool. And so any of us have access to that. I believe I shared that with the board, but also shared with that with the community. And we truly can see what are the different learning models that are being implemented across the state and across our region. Knowing that the guidance that we receive as a school district truly is from our King County health partners. Those are the districts I spent some time looking at today to understand truly what is the provision of services that are currently being offered really within our region with the districts that are receiving the same guidance as we are. And so right now, the majority of districts in King County are truly moving forward with a plan to implement in-person learning services for elementary learners. That is true for the majority of districts, but that's not true of every district in our region. And so that's the data that's available. I also know that currently we have a number of districts that are planning for the provision of secondary services within their district. But at this time, within our region and within our county, and when I say within our county, the only district that has a provision of secondary services is Enumclaw School District for secondary. And so I know there's a smaller school district within our region that has dates and plans to bring secondary students back, but I also know that other districts are discussing it without specific timelines in place yet. It's also important to note that there are districts in King County that have not welcomed any students back onto campus yet. And so there's some just to the south of us, and there's one just to the west of us. And so it's just important to know that districts are all across the map as they are working towards providing in-person learning services for their students. And so any questions about that, board members? Because I know that was a question that you had. Okay.
I apologize, no, not tonight, but if you have questions, what I would ask, I should mention this now. For those at home and those here in person, the best way to send your questions to have them answered is to send them by email. So I would ask that you do that after the meeting tonight. Write down all your questions, send them all in one email, and I'd appreciate doing that. So, yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and so one of the other questions that the board asked was, are there secondary services being provided in person beyond our provision of special education services in our Learning Center and Transition Center programs? And so I did poll our secondary administrators to find out. I mean, I knew that the answer was yes, but I wanted to quantify that for the board. And so right now we have about 800 secondary students that are receiving in-person supports. Those are in the areas of academic, organization, and what one school titled attendance support. The supports range from 1 all the way up to 5 days a week. And on average, they're about 2 hours in duration, with the range being from 30 minutes up to 6.5 hours. And so our schools, through what we provided through the summer letter of understanding, we titled them as equity hours because it really was about providing additional supports for students. So they're able to provide those supports during the school day in person for those students that are identified. Eric?
I want you to finish this topic, but I do want to actually return to what you just, when you paused before to ask for questions. I realize I do have a question that I'd like to ask tonight.
Great. Do you want to, so that's the information I have around academic services at the secondary level and in person. Do you just want to go ahead and ask your question now?
Yeah, thank you. So you earlier referenced that there were two districts in King County, I think you said, that had dates at least in a plan to have students return. What can you tell us about the model of provision of services that those districts are implementing?
You know, I'd probably be remiss if I tried to give you the exact models for their secondary return.
I understand it. I guess in general terms, are you able, I mean, how many days a week? Is it hybrid? Is it full-time?
Ballpark it.
Yeah, so I believe they are 2-day-a-week models or they are an AM/PM model. So about half of what a typical in-person model would be.
Okay, that's consistent with what I saw, which was half day, 2 days a week, 2 days on, 5 days off model, a hybrid model. Does that comport?
It's either 2 consecutive days or 2 days, like a Monday, Thursday.
Yeah.
But yes.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
So John, on the secondary services being provided, there's a related question. I'm not sure if it's coming up or if now's the time to ask it. But for kids who are struggling academically or emotionally, this is the issue for parents. And if we aren't coming back, what additional supports are coming to help make that possible for these kids to receive support? I know we've got a counseling and things like that, but is that an issue that we're going to get into, or is that something that we're...
You know, I believe Matt is going to talk about that tonight, great. And so I wonder if we just hold on that, and if it doesn't get answered, why don't we bring that back up and answer that?
Great. Thank you.
Okay, and so another way that we have students on campus, our high schoolers, is through our athletics program. And that has been truly guided by the WIAA and the governor's guidance around sports. And one of the things we implemented in accordance with WIAA was what they called athletic training. And so that was just student athletes being able to sign up to participate with other student athletes in training. There was very rigid protocols in place to make sure that they were maintaining the same group that they were training with, that they maintained that group each week. They could not switch groups. And so we had 1,755 student athletes participating for over 6 weeks. Those training programs were 2 times per week and for the duration of an hour. And so I think I've mentioned this to the board before, but it was pretty remarkable to be driving by our high schools with student athletes out in the pouring rain participating in their athletic training. And then just this last week, we started our fall sports with football starting, I believe it was last Wednesday, and then all the rest of our fall sports started just today. And our fall sports are football, boys golf, boys tennis, boys and girls cross country, slow pitch softball, girls soccer, girls swim and dive, and volleyball. And all told, we will have 1,567 student athletes participating in just the fall season, which just started now. Then we will enter into the winter season, and then we will enter into the spring season. All shortened seasons, but allowing those students to participate in those activities. Moving to 21-22 planning, and I think I want to just start by saying that we're committed to bringing back our students in person for the 21-22 school year. If we could make that decision now, we would say all students are back full-time in the 21-22 school year. But there are some factors that I want to talk about tonight that we are accountable to and that we have to navigate as a school district. And so currently, all districts in the state of Washington are waiting for the Washington Department of Health and the governor's office to make a determination around what are the health and safety requirements that school districts are going to be accountable for the 21-22 school year. As you know, or as you may have heard, the distancing requirement that is currently in place of 6 feet is absolutely the most impactful mitigating measure for us to offer a full-time in-person provision of services. And so those are conversations that every time we are in a meeting with public health, with the governor's office, with the Department of Health, with OSPI, we continue to voice that by the fall, that there's going to be an additional mitigating measure in place, and that is many of our community members will have been vaccinated by that time. Because when you think about the mitigating measures that are in place in schools, right now we don't have the availability of the vaccine. But once we do, that's a mitigating measure that when we think of the totality of mitigating measures, that's what provides health and safety. It isn't any one. It isn't just masking. It isn't just distancing. It isn't just attestation. It's all of them put together, and then when you layer on the vaccine as another set of mitigating circumstances, we believe that we can actually reduce that distancing measure, because that's really what would allow us to provide the highest level of in-person learning services for our students. And so just this Wednesday, I'll be meeting with the Department of Health, those that are actually writing the COVID-19 guidance, because for me, I feel it's my responsibility to continue to advocate for our district, because for some districts who may have additional space, the 6-foot distancing may not be as impactful. For Lake Washington School District, our schools are absolutely filled to the brim with students. We do not have additional classrooms. We don't have additional schools. And so for us, that 6-foot distancing truly creates a situation where we only can have half of the students on campus at any one time. And that is the requirement that is truly the most significantly impactful. When we think about next school year, what are we doing? In the meantime, what are we planning for? Well, unfortunately, we're planning for 3 different models. And those 3 models, number 1 is a full in-person model. The second is a full hybrid model. And the third is a hybrid or a remote model. And why would I include remote there, but not under the second condition? So right now, the state has essentially waived the requirement to have students sitting in a seat to count as attended. And so, but if that goes away, then we actually can't provide remote learning services for students, and we will be required to provide, if they maintain the distancing, we'll be required to maintain a hybrid model, because we can't provide full in-person learning services for 100% of our students with that one measure in place. And so it's just important to note that we're actually planning for all 3 of these, but we're hoping that that guidance and those requirements come through as soon as possible so that we can actually focus on one of these and not have to try and plan for all 3. But that's the work that we're doing. There's been a question about the district using a lottery approach to providing in-person services for the 21-22 school year. To be honest, I'm not sure where that came from, but I just want to, for the record, go ahead and state that that is not what we would be doing as a district, that we would identify once the requirements come through which model we were able to provide, knowing that more students sitting in seats more of the time is what we will continually be working towards as a school district. And so, so the lottery question that I think has been asked, I just want to go ahead and dispel that rumor that that is not how we would approach in-person learning services for the 21-22 school year. I just want to pause there before I jump to graduation. Mark?
Quick question, just to make it very clear to everyone, was the lottery ever on the table whatsoever?
Thank you, Mark. It was not,
Okay.
and so I'm not sure where that came from.
Will it ever be?
No, because that's not how we would offer the provision of
Thank you.
in-person services.
I'm sorry. Our high school classes, I know it varies from subject to subject, especially the narrower the topic gets, but what is the average we have in a classroom, and what is the average size of a classroom?
At the secondary level?
Yes, sir. Ballpark it. I know.
Yeah,
Ask for the inches.
average I'm going to give you is right around 30.
Okay.
Knowing that there's some classes that are lower than that.
Yeah, right.
But there's some classes that are also higher
Yes.
than that.
Yes.
Mhm.
And they're in a size of a classroom that can accommodate 30. Can they accommodate them with 6 feet apart?
So they couldn't accommodate 30 students 6 feet apart.
How many could they accommodate?
They can accommodate generally 15. What we found with our elementary model as well, the majority of our elementary classrooms could accommodate 15, but there were a few schools with a few classrooms that could accommodate only 12 because of that 6-foot distancing requirement.
If you could hold your
Oh,
question.
sure. I'm sorry.
I just want to make sure everyone
Don't-
has a chance.
I'm going to hold it again.
Okay, then I guess I'm making you hold so I can ask a question. Dr. Holman, I just want to make sure I understand. If the, under the current guidelines that are in place, in particular the guideline that requires 6 foot of spacing for students, if that were to remain in place for the fall of next year, we could not bring back all of our students, is that right?
For full-time services?
Correct.
No, we could not.
Okay. And it would be, if that were to remain in place, it would have to be a hybrid model of some sort, assuming all else held constant.
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
Siri's hands up.
Oh, sorry. Director Bleasner, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, however, I believe you asked the question. I was asked the same question around the 6 foot. So with the other mitigation measures, those don't have the limitation. It really is the spacing requirement.
Correct. Yes.
And we're in the process to continue those conversations with those in charge as looking at the science and the different components around that distancing to ensure that that's getting looked at.
Yes. Just coming up on Wednesday, I'll have a meeting with Department of Health.
Thank you. That's a continued conversation that needs to happen. I know we've been holding it in different places as well, so
Yes.
that's a great value. Thank you.
Can I also just make a quick comment around, there's in the decision tree, in the high risk category, it says, I don't have it right off the top of my head, but it essentially says you can have 15 students in a classroom, but no more than that. And then when you get to the moderate range and the low risk range, it actually doesn't reference class size any longer, yet we still have this requirement to maintain 6-foot physical distancing. And so the requirements come from two different places, yet those two guidances have to both be implemented with fidelity at this time. And so that's why the decision tree doesn't continue with their number of students, yet our requirement to maintain 6-foot physical distancing does.
I think Director Bleasner has a follow-up question. Go ahead. Director Bleasner?
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't hear. I would just like to say there is a lot of conflicting comments around the 6-foot space as well. So it's not just that we would advocate to get rid of it because it makes it easier. It really is because there is a degree of science and research coming out over time looking at that as a required mitigation measure.
Right. Thank you. Yes, we'll return to Director Stewart and then Director Carlson.
Okay, what is the impact of, elementary classes? You're going to be basically, you're in the classroom, you're staying there, you're not moving between classroom to classroom to classroom. What is the impact of having the students remixing every hour, if you will? And what does that do to any kind of mitigation efforts, if at all? I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question. And what does it do to if we have to do cohorts to trace them?
Contact tracing?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I'll try and answer it this way. I believe that's why the decision tree was built the way it was, continually working towards providing the provisions of services for our youngest learners first, those with highest needs first, and then transitioning to full elementary, and then after elementary, transitioning middle school. And once you've done all of those well, then high school. And so it truly is built on those that are cohorted or put into groups first, being able to be to receive in-person services, knowing that at the high school level, the interactions, the hallway, it's just, there's so much intermixing. And I believe that's why the decision tree was built the way it was, because it truly was looking at those that are able to group, knowing that those in the high school, that's just, the conditions are just tremendously different.
And just
Director Carlson?
to build on that, I wanted to point out that the decision tree very clear about starting with your youngest students, K1, then 2, 3, then 4, 5. I mean, we are following that as best we can, but we've hit a stumbling block because we have a district where we have no room, no extra teachers, and now 6 feet between students makes that an impossible problem to solve. And my understanding is that we've been in conversation with the authorities routinely, and they've pretty much assured us that by the end of this year, that's not going to change. Is that an accurate statement?
For this school year?
Yeah.
Correct.
So, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Director Stewart.
And maybe Matt and Mike are going to address this later, but tell me, can you describe a little more robustly how the students go into groups, if you will, for the academically challenging times, the ones who are struggling, the ones that you mentioned of the groups, whether they're having the anxieties, problems, whatever, how will they be placed and how many will be able to be placed?
Yeah.
I don't know if do they have to apply and show their grades or what? I don't know. That's
It will be both a combination of because we have data on students that are, not succeeding academically.
Right.
That data is within our systems. But we don't always know the students that are socially, emotionally not well.
So that's going to have to be voluntary, if you will.
Correct. That's going to have to be a collaboration between the school and family to be able to identify that, to be able to provide services to those students. And so it's going to be both school reaching out to families, but also families reaching out to school.
Are we increasing the number of, whether it be social workers or however you want to refer to it, mental health counselors? Are we going to be able to contract for more, so if we have more problem, we can actually deal with it?
Yeah, so Johnny Fu, our Director of Student Services, he's in contact with our providers, because we contract out the majority of our mental health support. And so he's in constant contact with them, and we're actually able to staff up as the need increases as well.
Okay. On the grade qualification, if you will, many families don't consider just F failing, D failing. There's even some families that might consider C failing. If that was the case, I probably wouldn't be out of high school. But the point is, how will that be determined with the families? Because if I've got a student that was an A student and all of a sudden he's a D or a C student, to me that child is failing. Now, it may not be on your I don't get applause very often, usually not from my wife, that's for sure. But that's what I'm trying to figure out, because what I see is creating a situation where it looks like it's going to work great, but then are we creating another conflict between parents and the school? I hope not, but I have a funny feeling that we might be.
And so, so when you identify that student, that you just, my first question would be, is it an academic challenge that they're having, or is it peer relations? Is it social, emotional? Is it, all of those pieces that they're missing? And so, to me, I'm not sure that they would receive an academic support, because if they have a history of academic, and I'll just say success, receiving high grades, I'll say, then we would want to address that through other avenues.
Okay, Director Sage, I think you had a question, and then Director Carlson.
I do have a question. So some of the students that apparently we're looking at bringing back in, I know we're talking about next year, but for this fall, bringing in this spring, we're talking about kids who need the extra academic support, and then kids who need, a different type of support, social, emotional, etc. But the way that it's been phrased kind of makes it sound like any kid who goes in for in-person services has an academic problem or is a failure. I'm not saying that's what you meant, but that's kind of what it feels like. If we're not inviting all kids in, and we've identified that these kids need this support and everybody knows it, I think we will have some students saying, I'm not going to show up.
Yeah, and so one of the pieces that I commented on, not only in the letter we sent to the community on Thursday, but also commented on in the recorded video on Friday, was that we want every student that wants in-person experiences to be able to have that offered to them. Because I know there are students that just want social and peer connection, because that's what's healthy and right for them. And so we've been talking about academic supports and whatnot, but it really is, when we think about all of the different types of experiences we want to provide, we also want to reach out to our current sixth graders to say, you've never been on your campus, so we want to invite you into your campus with your peers, do those typical transition activities that we always do with our elementary students as they transition to middle school. We have ninth graders that have never stepped foot on their high school campus. We want to do the same thing. We have seniors that really deserve a culminating activity. And so those are other types of supports, but it's really about peer connection. It's about really continuity of services for the next school year as we think about students transitioning. So it isn't just about helping students with a problem, but it's about connecting students and those pieces as well.
So that scarlet letter type of fear is lessened, is that what you're saying, or is diminished?
Will you say that one more time?
I said, so that scarlet letter type of fear of being
right.
identified as the wrong student or the bad student, quote unquote, or the failing student will basically it diminishes because you're blending a number of reasons why they're in?
Yeah, our school campuses are really our students' places. And so, when I'm on our campuses right now, our secondary schools, today got to drive by one of our high schools and, seeing multiple sports out practicing. Those are students that, they play a sport because it's their passion, it's what they love, but you also play a sport because of connection. Because it provides you with a team atmosphere, with the opportunity to connect and dialogue with people that have a similar interest as you. And so it's about getting students back onto our campuses to the greatest degree possible because that's where we want them. And we want this spring truly to be a launch point into the 21-22 school year.
But I'm just going to do a quick time check. So Dr. Holman has a lot to cover. In particular, we're going to be hearing about how you evaluated and selected the model for the rest of the year. So I want to make sure we move through this to get to that. And I think a lot of these questions are getting there. Director Carlson and Dr. Carlson did have a question, and Director Bleasner, but if we could we'll do a couple more and then we'll hold questions and let Dr. Holman continue the presentation.
I had one where you had almost answered it, and that is the sports. To me, it's not about necessarily the athletics, it's about the social reconnection and allowing the students. And it's a way to pod students logically, which is a lot easier than figuring out how to do class-to-class reassortment in the hallways. For other extracurricular groupings, are those also being resumed?
Absolutely. So when you think about the other types of extracurriculars, our activities and our clubs, again, that is individuals with a passion in a particular area, and getting them together is going to be important as well. And so that's moving forward as well.
Okay.
And so allowing our clubs, our activities to be able to meet in person, to do their activities in person, because we know there are, we heard it articulated very well tonight about science. It's hard to do some of those hands-on things when you're in a remote space. And so that's true of many of our clubs and activities as well. Also thinking about things like choir, band, orchestra, knowing that there's some health and safety pieces that we have to mitigate there as well, just because of the implementation of their activity. But there's guidance around that, and I know those students are pretty excited to get back in person as well for those.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Siri?
Director Bleasner?
So actually, my question follows up on what Dr. Holman was just speaking to, was in regards to the opportunities of our academic classes that require hands-on, so such as science labs. Are we looking at opportunities to bring kids in to be able to do a lab on campus? As we speak to these other programs, ceramics, I think, there's something of being able to be in the classroom. So is that the goal going forward? And that's open to all students, would be my understanding.
Yeah, and so those are, just to be transparent, those are the things that we are currently bargaining with LWEA, because it's around working conditions for staff in those environments. And so, yes, those are pieces we're looking at as well.
Right, and in regards to that, we know the mitigation measures that are there and how to do so, so that should seem a reasonable thing we can negotiate.
Yes, and when we think about it in those terms, it's also taking into consideration, I think we heard the stats around the average age of teachers across the country. We also, the average age of our secondary teachers are older than our average age of our elementary teachers. And so we actually have more staff in our secondary schools that are in the increased risk category. So it's also taking those things into account as well when we're thinking about those services. And so, Could it be with a different teacher than you currently have rostered for your class? It could be, but it's working through those details as well.
That's great. I mean, my son attends Cal Poly. He's been online all year, and they focused on bringing anything back that required hands-on in the classroom as their focus. Unfortunately, he is not. He is still online. But at the same time, I think that's a great approach to go forward with.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so we'll hold questions, and Dr. Holm, if you could continue the presentation.
Okay, I have one more piece, and I have 2 bullet points around it, and it's graduation for 2021. As the board knows, I have a senior in high school this year, and so this question is asked of me in my household quite often. But we are working through really the guidance to develop parameters for graduation right now. We've reached out to a couple of venues in King County because we have large venues in King County that actually are being evaluated right now to determine if they can have a larger capacity than what the actual guidance currently provides for. And the current guidance lands somewhere between allowing 200 to 300 individuals in a single setting. And so we're getting guidance on which set of requirements we're held accountable to, because one set of guidance says one thing and another set of guidance says another thing. So if you just take 300 as the number for a graduation ceremony, that's including participants, observers, staff. And so when you think about, why don't we take Redmond High School, they graduate about 500 students a year. If you have a graduation, plus you want to have family participant, plus you want to have staff there, you can graduate about 75 to 100 at one time, turning it into about 5, 6, 7 different graduation ceremonies. And so we're thinking through all of those, and as soon as we have information about what it can look like, we will get that out to families. We also know if we offer an in-person graduation, there's going to be families that opt out of that. And so we're also going to conduct a virtual graduation, such as we did last year, to make sure that every student has the opportunity to be recognized as part of the graduating class of 2021. And so we have a team who has been actively working on this for quite a while and narrowing in on these pieces. We have not received any guidance from OSPI around graduation. And to be honest with you, I'd rather they were just silent. So we can just take the guidance that's out there, work with it, because I think we can implement something pretty good, so.
Okay, so Dr. Holman, just to preview what's coming up next, my understanding is that Matt Gillingham is going to be presenting, and then also Mike Van Orden.
Yes.
So, and those are going to be on different topics than what you just addressed. But,
Correct.
Well,
Correct.
Related, but subtopics.
And so, Eric, just to be specific, there were a number of questions that were raised around how could you have come to this conclusion for secondary schools? And so both Matt and Mike are going to share, provide the thinking, additional thinking that went into the process to make this decision, some of the decision points along the year that led us to where we are now.
Excellent, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for previewing that. So any questions on what we've heard so far, and then we'll move into the...
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, so,
Director Carlson.
sorry, speaking as a parent of a last year graduating senior, I've seen what happens. And I'm curious, is the conversation around graduation simply the graduation ceremony, or are the other events that are closure of high schools on the table?
Yeah, and so that's the...
And I mean closure, not by closing. I mean providing the students a sense of closure.
Absolutely. When I lumped seniors into the kind of that transition activity, it's about culminating their experience in K-12 education. It's really a launch point for our students, and we want to recognize that. So it's also planning those types of activities. One of the activities I heard today the sunrise, seniors at some schools, they go to sunrise on the first day of school and then they go to sunset on the last day of school. Those are just traditions that students have done for years and years. And we want to be able to allow those kinds of things in accordance with health and safety standards as well. And so it's about allowing our students to have those experiences, culminate their K-12 experience along with it.
Okay.
Okay. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and open your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Yes, the youngest students, feel free to run if it's bedtime.
Right. But I really encourage the rest of you, if you can stay at all, I think the details would be really helpful to you. So we've given you bare bones. I'll be the first one to say that. To me, it's bare bones. I want to be able to hear where the meat is and how they're actually, what led them to the decisions they've come to, whether you agree with them or not. I want to see where the rubber meets the road here. And if that works for you, fine. If you can't stay, I understand. But I really encourage you all.
Hear me okay?
Yes.
You're a little quiet, John. Could you turn up the volume?
Shannon, would you mind sending me a text just to confirm if I've got audio coming through?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You might have muted it. Maybe I can message him.
Okay, wonderful. All right, thank you, Dr. Holman. Thank you, members of the board. And thank you all my friends that are texting me to say that you can hear me, so appreciate that. I am going to just share, if I can get back to it, share a couple of slides that kind of walk us through our experience for kind of this year. And so is that displaying? Okay, I can see a lot of people see
Yes.
me, but not my screen yet. All right, thanks. The live has a delay, so so trying to think about how do we tell the story of our experience this year, and trying to responsibly implement the guidance that we're receiving in order to keep our students and our staff safe, and particularly as we look at returning them to campus. So I went back and I mapped out, I took a data point from every week from the King County Public Health's data dashboard for one data point every week to kind of show the trajectory of the number of cases per 100,000 over a 14-day average. And thought this would be a kind of a good way to help us kind of understand the way that we have experienced and try to navigate this. So we opened school on the 2nd of September, and within the first couple of weeks of school, we had begun to serve some of our students with special needs on campus. A number of these students are not able to mask and have other needs, and we had worked with our staff who support those students in ensuring that they had the appropriate PPE, so face masks, KN95 masks, gowns, and that we'd done training with them to be able to serve some of our students right away. At that time, we were, for most of our students, in a remote learning model. Guidance that we'd received from public health over the summer had caused us to shift to remote learning model. But then towards the end of September, the Department of Health provided us with our first really concrete set of guidance with metrics and around the provision of educational services and what schools would need to attend to and be able to demonstrate in order to return students to school. So within a few weeks of starting in a remote learning environment, and Mike, I think, is going to talk about kind of what that experience has been like in transitioning our school system to that model. We had some guidance, we had some clear targets of what it would take to get back in person. At that point in time, we were in the moderate range, and that is defined by the Department of Health defined that as being 25 to 75 cases per 100,000 over 14 days. We had begun to plan for our return of our elementary students, and I'll go through the phasing guideline in a little bit more detail in just a second. And unfortunately, we quickly moved out of the moderate range and into what's the high range, which is greater than 75 cases per 100,000. So that guidance that we were provided at the end of September 2020, in the high range, strongly recommended distance learning with the option for limited in-person learning for small groups. And so during that time period, we were serving some of our students with special needs, and we also began serving some of our students, small groups of students. Dr. Holman had mentioned students that we at secondary, but also at the elementary levels in small groups. At the moderate level, the recommendation was distance learning, but considering expanding in-person learning to elementary students. So that's we prioritized our efforts in the fall on our elementary schools and looking at first how to provision them to meet the safety measures that I'll go through here in just a moment. Over time, in a moderate range, we could consider adding hybrid in-person learning for middle and high school students if limited COVID transmission occurs in schools. So one of the things that we would be looking for there is how are we monitoring and tracking the transmission within our schools. So within that guidance, and these guidelines still remain in place under the new decision tree, but schools have to be able to demonstrate the capability of doing these items. So we have to have the plans, the staff, the space, and the supplies to do the following. So protecting students and staff and students at higher risk for severe COVID-19 while ensuring access to learning. So for us, that's maintaining a remote learning option, even as we've begun to transition some of our elementary students back in person, continuing to maintain that as an option for some of our staff and for our students. Transportation or facilitating drop-off and pickup of students. So our buses are running at limited capacity for our elementary schools right now. We have about 20% of our students are needing transportation to and from school at the elementary level. And so so we have some reduced capacity there, but we've been able to continue to provide that. Dr. Holman talked about grouping students or cohorting students. So we have students in groups of no greater than 15. And at the elementary level, that's fairly straightforward because students have one class that they're assigned to for the majority of the day. And we've kept our specialists, so like our PE or library, or music, we've kept those in a remote environment so that we're not mixing classes together. So the elementary level, we've been able to do that. The secondary level, as Dr. Holman talked about, that gets a little bit more challenging. And then practice physical distancing of 6 feet among students and staff. So we went through efforts to our support services department, had mapped out all of our classrooms, come up with a layout for how you would have students 6 feet apart, provided those. We had our custodial staff move rearrange our classrooms, remove excess furniture, been out visiting our elementary schools. There's a lot of markers for students to remind them what 6 feet look like, and our teachers and staff are doing a lot of teaching around how to for our students to stay apart from each other. Promoting frequent hand washing and sanitizing. We have, we're lucky in a lot of our elementary classrooms to have sinks, which make it easy to promote hand washing. But one of the themes that we've been working on and trying to figure out is how do we, for our students in portables that are not equipped with sinks, what are the solutions that we can to ensure that our students are able to frequently hand wash when that's appropriate or sanitize when that's appropriate. And so that's been everything from looking at technical solutions like having hand washing stations to building into the schedule hand washing times and having to think about extra supervision for those instances where if we have to have students in a portable. Promoting and ensuring face covering and use among staffs. We as a district, we have been fortunate that we've been able to purchase over 80,000 masks of varying degrees. So everything from cloth-based masks for students and staff to disposable masks to KN95 masks. We've revised our custodial matrix to increase cleaning and disinfection, and we've developed a ventilation plan that really emphasizes 100% exchange with outside air to ensure that we're not recirculating air within our school buildings. So for all these items, we have plans, procedures, and revamped operations in order to be able to say yes to each of them. However, particularly the grouping of students and the physical distancing of 6 feet are problematic as we get to our secondary schools, where students move more freely, and our schools in general tend to be more crowded. The other set of conditions that Public Health or Department of Health had laid out is, are we ready to monitor and respond to suspected and confirmed cases of COVID-19? So can we ensure monitoring of symptoms and history of exposure among students and staff? So we have implemented with our school staff, with our nurses, screening and attestation processes at each of our schools for anybody that comes into our buildings. We have a case management system that our nurses track and monitor when people are, either symptomatic or have a report a positive case. And we've done really well with the number of students and staff that we've had on our campuses for the first semester. We've averaged about a case a week, but we have no known knowledge of any transmission within our schools. And so as we are in the process of increasing the number of students and staff in our schools, that's something that we're continuing to look at. How do we make those systems more efficient? We have been working with our partners at Microsoft, who have been developing a number of tools. We're one of the pilot districts in the state. And those tools, particularly around reporting and case management, are of particular interest to us. So that we can ensure that we're monitoring the experiences of our staff and students, and so that we're able to assess for their safety. We have plans to manage when students or staff get sick on site. We've actually established a dedicated room we call it the Q room, where students or staff can go, has a negative airflow, and so we have letters for communication. At this point in time, our community has adequate testing. The state has a new pilot. The State Department of Health has a pilot system for testing that we are reviewing, because as we expand, we want to increase our capacity to be able to do testing on site. We particularly don't want students or staff to not have access to that. And so while there is that access within the community, we're looking to facilitate that more readily. And then the last two bullets here are really related to our public health capacity, and they continue to be able to meet those at this point in time. In December, mid-December, the State Department of Health issued a new set of guidance. They call it the decision tree. And at that point in time, we still were in the high range, two things really changed. One was the level of the case rate. So it went from being greater than 75 for being in the high to greater than 350. So this really starts to open up more opportunities in terms of thinking about the provision of services. They also changed the guidance or of what correlated with high and moderate phasing. And so that's, I think, really important to note that that shift has both created some new opportunities for us as we've worked through, and has also worked to kind of accelerate some of the time frames. So that guidance said to phase in-person learning in groups of 15 or fewer students for pre-K through grade 5 and those with the highest needs. Prioritizing pre-K through grade 3. And if schools can demonstrate the ability to limit transition in the school environment, begin to add grades 4 to 5. And then the moderate level, that's phase in-person learning. So in both of these cases, in moderate and high, one of the key aspects of it is the phased-in approach. And that phased-in approach for us is important because it allows us to test both our assumptions, our systems. It allows us to see which systems need to evolve in order to scale, which ones are working effectively. We are using like for example, for our attestation process, we're using a paper process, and we're doing that intentionally. It's very visible, so it's easy to see whether students, as they come in the door, whether they've done it or not. So it makes a point of kit entry a very easy and quick transaction. It's very friendly. Lots of adults can use that, and the more adults that we can have greet students through that process, the friendlier that is, and the quicker that we're able to get our students in to maximize their time in school. And yet, there's also some drawbacks with it. It uses a lot of paper, and it requires, some challenges with some record keeping. And so we're continuing to look at, like I said, in our partnership with Microsoft, the different attestation systems, and we're wanting a phased-in approach allows us to see and test as we're scaling up the number of students and staff that we have in schools to ensure that that our assumptions about the operationally what's going to work best to keep our students and staff safe is hold true, and to be able to make tweaks in between times where we're bringing students back in. Moderate phasing did also open up the door to start bringing middle school students back. And then if schools can demonstrate the ability to limit transmission, begin to add more high school students. And so as we got into with that guidance, that begins to open up the door for us to begin to think about a number of different opportunities for bringing our students back in person, and ways in which thinking about how do we both need to phase that, bringing the students back in appropriately, as well as thinking about ways in which we might accelerate that. So Dr. Holman talked about athletics for us at the high schools. Actually, it's been great to create opportunities for some of our students, but it's also allowed us to look at how would we cohort students at the high school level, and how can that be a model for activities and other services that we would provide at a high school model that's going to be at a fairly large scale. And when we talk about the number of students that are participating in athletics, that's a significant number of students. And so having some of those programs go early that are now we're now beginning to be allowed us to kind of have them as an early adopter. This guidance, as it came in our moderate range is in the 50 to 350 range. Dr. Holman made his announcements on the beginning of January about returning, first starting with our elementary students. We return our K1 students just a couple weeks ago, and are set to return our 2-3 students here in another couple weeks, followed by our 4-5 students at the end of March. And just finally, just kind of walking back through this, and note that our current transmission rate is about where we were at in mid-October, where we were in the high rate. So we've we've kind of gone through the shifting of not only the dynamic case rate and trying to plan appropriately and make decisions around that, but then also the shifting in our guidance. And so, all of this, while all of this has been going on, Dr. Holmes talked about that we've actually been actively negotiating return of students at the elementary level throughout the fall, and have begun to culminate that work with the K1 in January, and wrapping up 2-5 here, and in preparation for a returning of our students. So I think I'm going to stop sharing. And so all of that really kind of then starts to set up how does the relationship between our health guidance and the relationship of the transmission of the fact of the virus within our community, how does that begin to inform our thinking around the educational model? And so I'm going to have Mike share it with Mike a little bit to have him talk about some of the educational models, and I'm going to come back downstairs and join the main board meeting.
Thanks. As Matt and I were preparing for today, we were having conversations about where we would present being in person for the first time in a year, actually. And we decided, given the fact that folks have taken the time to be here tonight, it was important for us to be here as well. Matt, on the flip side, had a presentation upstairs, and so that's why he's upstairs. But I wanted to start my comments tonight just by saying thank you to the families who are here tonight, to the families that are outside engaging in a civic process to advocate for your kids. I speak to you, board members, as an employee of the district, but also as a father of a student who's in college right now, whose last year in high school last year as a senior was radically changed, who we worry about every single day in college, who's suffering emotionally, not having peer connections, a wife who's a teacher in middle school in a neighboring district that I won't name, who is every day in tears just trying to make remote learning work, and is even more concerned about what they're moving into and her worry about that. So I speak to you as not only an employee, but also as someone who's experiencing this, and as some folks said tonight, from a position of privilege, knowing that we're pretty well off, and there are families, including some of the folks here tonight, who expressed how much harder this environment is for them. And so we're humbled by that, and I just want to say how much we appreciate the comments that were made and the call to action that was made. So with that, I wanted to provide some context for how we have been making decisions actually since last June. And those decisions weren't made lightly. They were made weighing costs and benefits, and I've heard some folks expressing that those decisions are challenges, and you're saying you can't get through challenges. And really, it's more a function of how do you look at the costs and benefits of different decisions and then move forward so that you're not constantly in this process of always admiring the problem, but continuing to make forward progress. And I think our work to bring our elementary students back and our students with disabilities back and our preschool students back is evidence of that work. But I also hear that there's this urgency. All right, my kid right now needs help. So again, my purpose tonight is really to explain kind of the rationale for why are we here with the secondary. And again, not to say that doesn't mean we still have work to do, but just to give people some rationale and give the board some information about that. So as Dr. Holman and Matt also just explained, we are in many ways defined by this social isolation or the social distancing requirement. More than anything else, the requirement to have, and again, that's changing, but the requirement to have about half the number of students in a classroom drives our instructional decisions, for good or bad. And again, we recognize the science is becoming more clear and we're getting better information, and that's changing. But as Matt mentioned, as we've been planning, we weren't in the same place we are now. So Planning has to be something that can't be done in a day or 2 days or 3 days. You have to be thinking multiple months out, in fact, almost a year out, and I'll explain more about that in a second. But if you use that as a starting point to say that we had to go with roughly half the number of students in a classroom in a school to maintain that social distancing, then that starts to define what you can do with an instructional model. And so we've looked at and evaluated multiple instructional models with that idea in mind of having to have roughly half as many students in a classroom. So the first one that seems most intriguing, and in fact, the first time I heard about it, I was going, that's it. And I would say that there are some districts around our state and nation that are looking at is one called a concurrent model, where a teacher has students in the classroom with them, and then other students are at home and they're watching on a webcam. It's using technology. It sounds like this amazing way to go. As you evaluate it further, however, and this is part of our process, you start to unravel that sometimes things that sound great on the surface in practice don't work. And so I'll give you an example of that. We know that there are certain strategies, effective practices for remote learning, and the remote learning's been around for a long time. Ways that you group students, ways that students can respond to questions, ways that students engage in the classroom. And that's one way of teaching. We know that there are effective practices informed by decades of research for classroom instruction. Those two are very different modes of teaching. And when a teacher is expected to do those at the same time, those start to diminish each other because a teacher is trying to do two things at once. And so rather than doing either one well, you end up doing both poorly. And so other districts that we've talked to that have tried this model are saying, you know, when we put it in practice, we're actually not serving our kids as well as we were when they were remote. So that was a factor in our decision making, going, promising model, we look at it in practice, and yes, maybe a few teachers are making it work, but to scale that to hundreds of teachers for thousands of kids, it wasn't showing promise. And so the question we have is, why would we continue down that road with a practice that we're not seeing working well? So then that leads us to another way of looking at instruction, and that is the idea of an AM/PM. Again, that's sounding very promising because it allows us to have students in school more days of the week. And so we look at how do we do that? Well, you, again, can have students in the morning and the afternoon, but given the instructional day is so long, then you're having students for less time. But again, they're in person, they're on campus, they're with teachers. So then we start to say, well, okay, now we have to transport them. We have had a bus driver shortage in our district for many years. This is not just a local problem, it's a state problem and a national problem. So we started running routes. Can we transport kids to school? We started thinking creatively about, could parents that have indicated that they're driving their kids to school, could we contact them and ask them to drive so we'd have less of a reliance on bus drivers? Even with that, as we started running our routes for elementary school, we were not able to route enough kids on those routes and get them to school on time in an AM/PM model. When we started scaling that to middle and high school, it wasn't possible. And again, it's not a challenge. You say, well, if we figured out a different way of doing it, it's a district that is large regionally, that has a transportation challenge, and we need to get kids to school. So again, we start to go, okay, we could run an AM/PM model, but that would mean the trade-off, the cost of that would be not transporting some of our kids to school. And again, there might be other districts that are able to do it. They're smaller, that rely on regional transportation. In our context, doesn't seem the cost of that was greater than the benefit of bringing kids to school for a couple hours a day in an AM or PM model. Again, in some ways, we were doing that with special education, but as we scaled up, we realized we weren't able to do that. So that leads you back into this hybrid, which we've heard tonight and talked about. It's a 2-day, roughly a week model where kids are either in person for 2 consecutive days and they're out for 5, or alternating days, or on a week and off a week. That's a viable model, and some districts are already doing it. The viability of that model, though, is dependent on, again, having advanced planning so that when you actually start the model, it's already set up. And so what I want to do is provide a little bit of context about why not a hybrid now in Lake Washington. So as you think about, and again, this is getting really into the details, but I think this is important. If you think about a secondary classrooms arrangement or the secondary schedule. It's complex, it's not rocket science, but it is complex, and there are dependencies in building a schedule like that. So I'll give you a very concrete example. Let's say you have 2 English classes, a first period and a second period, one teacher or another teacher. And in one class, you have about a third of the kids that want to be remote. Another class, you have about 2/3 of the kids that want to be remote. Well, again, as you're thinking about that schedule, you go, hey, I'll just combine those two classes, take all the kids off that want to be remote, put them with one teacher, take the other kids that want to be in person, take them with the other teacher. Easy, right? Then you go, okay, wait a minute now. Those kids I just moved into the second period now have a different class, second period. So their schedule is changed, which means that you have to find another teacher to teach that class. Similarly, you have classes where there's a single teacher who only teaches a certain number of courses. As soon as you take a class away from that teacher, suddenly that teacher may not be able to teach the same period and that class is no longer accessible. Now, again, that sounds really like, well, why would you worry about that? But those effects ripple through a master schedule. So ultimately, you're offering fewer classes. You're not able to give students courses they might need for graduation, courses they need for prerequisites. And again, still doable because many districts are doing this, we know this. But the way you do it is by having it done in advance. So before students enroll, you create the schedule. You say half of our kids have been pulled off to be remote, half are in person. And then you create a schedule with courses that are available and they enroll for it. That window has to happen November, December, maybe early January at the very latest, so that you can get kids in, so you can staff it, so you can make it work. As Matt was sharing, that window, we were in a phase where that just wasn't an option at the time. So we said, okay, we'll hold. Maybe it'll get better, and if it does, we can start creating those schedules. And it continued to not get better. We said, okay, if we can't create a schedule from scratch, what would be the cost of throwing it all out and doing what I say, just try to restart the schedule middle of the semester, right, roughly where we are now. And the cost of that, of trying to do it after kids are already enrolled in classes, means one, kids are losing classes that they're already enrolled in. Without exception, we'll lose kids, the classes. It means that kids will have multiple different teachers. And we will say, well, in elementary school, we had kids that got different teachers. Well, in elementary school, you have one teacher for a grade level that covers all the subjects. You have grade level teams that meet together. And so, for example, if a student moves to a different teacher, that team sits down and says, let me share information about the class and that student. How does the student learn? What are the things that will motivate that student? What are the ways we get them engaged? When you try to do that at a secondary level with 150 students per teacher, 7 periods per day, you lose all that academic connection. So you start to see that, yes, making a change midpoint in elementary works, but at secondary, you start to pull apart the continuity, the academic continuity. So we lost classes. We have kids that are changing teachers, and we can't track the information that would help the next teacher succeed with that kid. And you might say, well, we have kids that change schedules at the semester and at the year, but those are typically with the beginning of a course, with content that's taught, and when you switch mid-year, you've lost all that information that a teacher has gained about a student. So those are just a few examples of the cost of switching from a fully remote to a hybrid schedule mid-span. Now, if we were able to do it earlier, we could have probably done it much more successfully. But trying to do it now, the costs are significant. The costs for students' coursework, the costs for their academic continuity. This isn't just about kids having an AP class or not having an AP class. This is radical changes in their education. And so we then looked at, well, what have we had in place? Now, the other thing I just want to share briefly is all of our teachers, without exception, have changed their instructional model, and they spent months and months, and they continue to plan for those changes. What happens if we say we're going to do that again in February or March? The cost of that in terms of the teacher readiness, the teacher skill, the teacher capacity for multiple classes, for hundreds of kids is significant. And so you weigh those. You go, okay, we do need to have kids back in person. They need to be on campus. They need to be with their teachers for social reasons, for emotional reasons, for academic reasons. The costs are so significant to switch to a hybrid model in February or March that you have to say, what are the alternate ways we can still meet those needs of social and emotional and academics so that we can still help kids and get them through the year, but don't discount the costs of a switch at this point in the year. And so again, folks may disagree with things I said and say, well, there's ways around all of those. And that's the challenge, right? We have to make decisions. We have to take the information we have in this dynamic environment that nobody's been in before. And yes, some school districts have been able to make switches sooner, and we totally acknowledge that. But again, with our decision-making in our context, that's how we arrived at the decision we did. That doesn't mean to say we're going to stop here and rest on our laurels. As Dr. Holman mentioned, we absolutely believe that kids need to be in person. And I think people legitimately ask, well, if you believe that, show us. And that's our obligation, that's our responsibility, and that's what we mentioned is some of our work ahead, and we need to do better. But I also want to say it hasn't been a process where we've just been sitting around and not have plans. As Matt mentioned, there's a context, and there's work that's happening, and there's continued bargaining that's happening, and again, we just want to say thank you for folks who are willing to continue with us and stick with us as we do it, and appreciate the offers of support. And so that's, again, pretty much just kind of a summary, and there's so much more depth to it, but I think it gives you a taste of what we experienced.
Matt, do you want to go ahead and just grab a microphone, and then Mike can use that mic. I'll stay here, and then the board, you can ask questions.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll take board member questions now. I saw a couple hands go up. We'll start over. Director Carlson, did you have a question? Did I see your hand go up?
I was going to let someone else go first.
Thank you. Director Stewart?
Mine's a simple question of logistics. We talked about the idea that when we compare districts, we compare comparable sizes, but we're comparing comparable sizes in population or square miles. Because if we may have a district next to us or beyond us that has 25,000, which is in the ballpark of what we've got, but yet they're more confined, if you will. How does that have an impact on the ability to move the buses around, move the kids around?
Yeah.
To me, that seems like two different animals, if you will, and unfortunately, they don't mix. Sorry.
Yeah, some people have asked, well, you have fewer kids that are in person, so you should have more capacity to transport, right? So again, you're right, we have a large regional district. And so even if fewer kids are in person, if you have one kid at a bus stop or 10 kids at a bus stop, you still have to go to that bus stop. We also socially distance kids on buses. So as we're trying to transport across a large region, we still have routes to run that are as complex, if not more, than typical years. And as I mentioned, we've been in a national driver shortage for years. We had to make some significant changes to our preschool programs 2 years ago, a week before school started because of driver shortages. So again, I hear people say it's a challenge, but it's also a reality. And you have to acknowledge it and work with the constraints of that to try to figure out how to transport kids. So bottom line, to go to your point, is transportation is a factor we have to consider, and our ability to transport all students is an obligation we have, and get kids to school is an obligation we have.
And we're basically 75 square miles?
Yeah, and I think folks in here know, driving across this district during the mornings can be an hour or more. I've gone from one school to another. It's taken me an hour and a half sometimes during the rush hour. So there's also traffic issues in our region that all are part of the transportation puzzle.
Mark, one other piece to that is, I think one of your questions is, well, if another district is doing something, can we just mirror that? One of the conversations I had with regional superintendents in the summer was, well, is there any way we could actually do things the same, like make decisions? And, because it would make sense that, if District A is doing something, then District B is able to do that. And in a short order, we realized conditions, variables are drastically different between districts. And some of that is what, demographic, regionally, what that looks like, distance-wise, number of staff. I could just point to right now. I think, Mike, you may know Bellevue School District better than me, but they had a whole specialist corps that they were able to bring back into the teaching corps. We did that to a small scale with our K-1. They had significantly more specialists. And so all of those variables are drastically different between all school districts. And so those implementations can help inform us, but then we have to take it into our context.
Yeah, and I would just add to that too. It's transportation is one of many variables. And it wasn't like we didn't look at creative solutions too. We talked about having instructional assistants and paraeducators and even teachers who have kids in their class drive buses. And again, you just looked at things like certification, the willingness of people to do that. We've done incredible recruiting efforts to make sure we have drivers just to transport the kids we do have. So again, I think there's an assumption, well, you haven't thought through all the different ways to creatively solve the transportation problem. And I just want to say that there have been efforts to do that. And even there, you've got to acknowledge when you hit a limit and continue to move forward.
Director Carlson.
So, as the parent of a sophomore who's in the throes of this mess, and with actually my two older sons also at home, I've watched this. None of what our speakers to the board have said is foreign to me. This is real. But I've also been in the room following over the course of months the negotiations, and I do agree that this has been an unsolvable problem given the constraints. However, now we're in a space where we're trying to be more creative, to move forward and find some way to fill the gaps creatively, rather than just trying to go back to where we were, because if that's impossible, we're going to change things. We're going to try and do things better within the constraints that are available to us. But the one thing I've heard from a bunch of parents tonight that sort of crystallized for me is that we as parents are all so very tired of being helpless, of not being able to help, of just having to deal with the situation. So how can parents help us solve these things that we're trying to do for social, emotional support? Not just necessarily even for their own students. Is there some way that we can use the efforts of our community rather than just having one more moment that all of us are sitting at home drumming our fingers and trying to figure out, what could I possibly do? Speaking as an epidemiologist, it's been driving me nuts. I can't even help give vaccines. This has been the most debilitating helplessness of last year, and I'm hearing a lot of that.
Yeah, there's a scale of that, right? There's my kid, and then I heard some people so eloquently say, I'm advocating for all kids. And so maybe starting advocating for all kids, our legislators need to hear. You have other states where they are providing the supports to get every kid back. That is not Washington State. I'm just going to be very blunt about that. So advocating at that level would make our work not easier, but it would make it more doable. So I would say that's a starting point. For your kids, parents are their kids' first best teacher. That's an adage we've had in education for many years. And as we've been saying tonight, we are going to be reaching out to kids to get them into schools, and it's going to be a very different, say, model for lack of a better term, but being able to share your information about your kid, not to bring them back in a group to be stigmatized, to say, how do we enrich their experience right now and advocate for them? And so that's one way as well. I think, as folks here said too, we want to be part of connections and planning and work like that, and that's an effort in an area we need to grow in. I will say we have started to reach out to families through board linkages. We have a student advisory group with representative students from all of our schools. It's a diverse group, and we're asking them for input and feedback as well. But I would also say it's a growth area for us.
Chris, I would also offer, when we think about, I was talking about recognition of seniors or transition activities. Those are best completed when we have parents helping, supporting, thinking through. And to date, we actually haven't had volunteers back on our campuses yet. And so that's a piece that we're going to have to go back to, the guidance and things like that. Are we able to actually have parents volunteer on our campuses? So that's a question we can go back and revisit. It was one of those pieces we revisited probably mid-fall and haven't really gone back to that. And so appreciate that.
Director Stu.
Back, partially a liability question, or is it the volume of people or a combination thereof?
Yeah, it's really both of those. And so we'll just have to go back to the guidance to see if that's been updated around having additional people that the district doesn't technically have responsibility for, and including that into the mix given the pandemic. And so given current case rates and things like that, we can go back and evaluate that again.
Sure.
We talked about testing and increased This one I left it on. Usually it's the mute I leave on. We're talking about increased testing as the test kits get more accessible. I know that some of the private schools around here have been testing, I think it's teachers twice a week and students once a week or vice versa. And basically they're charging the parents $50 a week for that help, if you will. Can you give me an idea, and maybe it's the idea that these are dollars we're going to have to get from the state, for the feds, whoever, but a ballpark of what we think it probably costs to test our kids every twice a week, once a week, whatever?
Are you talking about academic testing or testing? Yeah, I was going
I'm sorry.
academic
I'm kind
testing.
of looking at you and
That's what I'm
over
thinking from
your
an
head.
academic perspective,
Sorry.
but I hear what you're saying. Thanks.
So my mic comes out.
Oh, sure.
My mic died. They haven't been used in a while. There we go. So, Director Stewart, what you're describing is known as surveillance testing, which is where you're using testing to kind of monitor the level of prevalence of the virus in a community. Back in November, the Institute for Disease Modeling did a report to essentially help school districts determine what testing strategies make sense given all of the other non-pharmaceutical interventions such as mask, hand washing, 6 feet distancing. And what that report found is that actually there wasn't a statistical difference in using surveillance testing versus all of the other interventions. And so public health hadn't been recommending for schools who are doing all of those other things to use surveillance testing. And it's not only is there a cost with the test, but it's very labor intensive, so it's not necessarily a good use of our staff's time. What the State Department of Health has developed, though, is a system for schools that we can use for symptomatic testing. And really the benefit of going with that approach is that if somebody's presenting with symptoms, those could be symptoms of COVID, but they could also be symptoms of something else. And in the absence of testing, a teacher or student is going to have to be out of school for a period of time, which actually has it's either a disruption to that individual student's learning, or it's actually a disruption to all of our students' learning. At the scale that we've been at, that hasn't been something that the community testing services has been able to meet that need. As we scale up, we're looking at the state system and how we would be putting that in place. Because as we get more and more students back and more teachers back, we don't want that access to testing to be an issue that's keeping people, either keeping them home if they need to be home, or having them access back. So, and that is not, my understanding is that's not something that has a cost for our students or staff. It'd be something we would figure out how we would staff and support it, and then, but it's not a surveillance system.
It's been suggested that would be one way to give teachers confidence to be in a classroom before they get this vaccine. Sorry. It's been stated or been said and debated around, I've seen that until the teachers can get vaccinated, this would be one way to give them confidence in knowing that they aren't walking into a microbe factory.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the outweighing the cost and intensity of service would be outweighed by the teachers then understanding, okay, I'm not walking into a war zone. I'm having, it's a fairly good, it's no less than I'm going to the grocery store. So if they had that confidence, that might bolster their emotional well-being to go into the classroom.
Yeah, and we're, one of the benefits of the state's pilot model was is what they found was the relationship between schools, what the prevalence within schools, and basically is commensurate with the rate within the community spread. And so,
That hasn't come up as big of an issue as access has been the broader concern. If I want access to a test, how can we help facilitate that? So now that the state has a program that is really geared towards schools, that's where they just released that the other week. We've been evaluating it so that we can implement that.
So we'll do Director Sage and then Director Bleasner.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge that working the remote model has been incredibly difficult, and I appreciate everybody's time. It has, I have hardly been able to work for money this year because I have been focused solely on students' well-being, students' education. And I've spent a lot of my time since I got on the board working on how do we make things more equitable for students. And when I look at the February 1st presentation, I believe it was called Remote Overview, and I see, and I only have this for K-5, but I see which demographics chose to be in person. I see that 63% of our Latinx families chose to be in person. I see that 61% of students from low-income households chose that model. I see that 54% of our Black students and their families chose in person. I'm going to take a guess that those percentages will be even higher for secondary, mostly because there's a lot more at stake the older our students get. I have a lot of concerns that we haven't given our students and families the opportunity for the in-person education that they need. We have Wednesdays that we could do something with. I think innovation is the only way we're going to get there. I'm completely confident that this team is full of innovators. We're just thinking in too linear of a manner at this time. We got hundreds of emails since Friday, which I thank you very much for. We heard from students, and I was trying to tally how many students we had heard from, but there was too many, because as soon as I'd start my tally, more would come in. And the students told us they're worried, they're anxious, depressed, angry, aggravated, sad, bored, worried about the ability to get into college. One said, try and remember your senior year, the memories and experiences you had, we are getting none. When will this torment end? And suicidal. So I just have a really hard time that we aren't able to offer something in person to a greater degree than we have for our afternoon opportunities. And I have to be true to myself and let you all know that. I think we can do better. Thank you.
Okay, Director, excuse me, thank you. Director Bleasner.
Thank you. So to just follow up with Director Sage, appreciate greatly the comments that are made and some of the challenges that we have seen, appreciate the families that have come forward and the students and hearing the conversation. And so I think this is the challenge as you put forth with this new support model concept that's going forward is how, as you think about this, how will we be ensuring that our students are getting those in-person opportunities effectively and that those who want them are able to do that? That's been a bit vague as to how that's going to play out. So I'm wondering as to when we would get some clearer guidance or directions in regards to what that actually means going forward as to what the time frame might be and what our families could expect in regards to those in-person components.
Siri, can you hear me?
I can.
You
Thank
can.
you.
Okay, just want to make. I'm across the room from the computer, so just wanted to make sure. Will you say that last piece again? I heard the comment around what is the timeline for communication, and then you added a second piece at the end.
I would say it's not just the communication. When can students expect to see in-person pieces coming forward, and when those would be, and how will that get framed out to people? Because I think the component with a piece of this is the hybrid model was very straightforward. It would start on such a day, and this is what would happen. This is a little more vague. I think the innovative possibilities of being able to really bring kids in and do different things and support them in a way that's even more effective and possibly something we can learn from going forward, I think is fabulous. I'm just concerned that it's vague. And the challenge with this going forward has always been the vagueness.
Okay, thank you. So part of, and I've said this about our K-1, I said this about our 2-5, we are required to negotiate the working conditions for this. And so with that, I've also said that we started our secondary negotiations with a sense of urgency. We met for 4 hours today. Again, in bargaining, we have bargaining scheduled throughout the week. And so I would anticipate us being able to wrap up our secondary negotiations. I would anticipate within probably 2 weeks, given the urgency and pace that we're working at right now. But we truly can't move forward if we don't have our negotiations completed.
Completely with a complete plan going forward. However, you have already moved forward in regards to some with the 800 kids you mentioned at the very start of this, correct?
Yeah, so that was we negotiated those additional support with I believe it was the summer letter of understanding, and then provided additional guidance. Matt, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so we had negotiated and built in supports, we called them equity hours. So each school was provided with different hours for staffing. In the December, we had expanded the guidance around that in order to, what we were finding is that they weren't really being used to the extent and the way that they had been designed. And so we shifted the guidance to encourage schools to bring students on campus, to provide them with supports for those equity hours, and that we had used data that we'd gathered from the fall, and schools were using that to identify students. So those students are being served through a tool that we'd already negotiated. And our schools have been expanding those services to the extent that they're able to under the conditions that were negotiated.
Great,
Director?
thank you. The other.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to ask you a
something
follow-up
else, Dr.
question.
Holman.
No,
Sorry, I can't see anything at this point.
we can still hear you. If you want to keep asking questions, let's do that.
Okay, so my other question was in regards to for the fall. You spoke briefly about the 21-22 timeframe. In thinking about Mike Van Orden's presentation, that sort of gave the timeframe and some of the parameters and the difficulties or challenges in the realities that we must work in. One of the comment was about when you have to plan for a hybrid model and setting that schedule in order to do so. So from what you've learned at this point, I'm assuming as you set up will you be setting up for those 3 plans in the fall that it could potentially be a different schedule if we have a hybrid in place, and that will be established prior so we could ensure it could open?
Go for it.
Yeah, and that's I won't say challenge, but that's something we'd have to do. So as I mentioned, once you know how many students are remote and how many students are in person, then you can create a schedule. That's the way we create schedules at secondary, regardless of the school size. We also know that smaller schools have fewer options because you have a harder time staffing them, but at least people know going in. And then students enroll for the courses that you can offer. So you make sure all the graduation courses are in place. You make sure prerequisites are in place. You make sure courses kids need for post-secondary are in place, and then they sign up for them. Now, you want to do that and also anticipate everybody back, and you have another schedule that you have the full range of options for kids, and any class a kid wants that they would typically have, they can sign up for. If you can run those both, then you're prepared for both, right? And so that, I think that would be the ideal, the Cadillac model. Our secondary principals, creating a master schedule is a months-long process, and so they need time to be able to create multiple options. Now, the other thing that I would add, as Matt mentioned, is as the guidance becomes clearer, as we find out more about immunizations, as we get through our secondary bargaining, that starts to define the picture a little bit better so you can start to move more towards one model and put more time and energy. As Dr. Holman mentioned, we've spent months, in fact, we've been planning since this whole pandemic started to think through all the different variables, and there's so much capacity you have to put towards any one problem. And so you want to, as soon as possible, focus your attention and really start to drill down into the details, because that's where the work is. So again, I think you're right, though, Siri, to go to the point of if you have multiple models mapped out and scheduled, then you can start on day one. And the challenge has been this year, we've always just been kind of catching up with the guidance because the guidance is constantly being adjusted and the rates are changing. And so learning from that would be to be more proactive about having multiple models developed.
Thank you. And thinking about the public comment that came tonight and our community wanting to help and being involved, I think of the master schedule as an algorithm and different components that come in. I think of our businesses in the area that this is what they do. Potentially, this is a place to look for some partnering of how we can more effectively utilize technology to drive these pieces.
Yeah, I would say I would say it's not so much a function, though, of our administrators not being able to create a schedule. Our administrators are skilled at that. We have technology that actually helps us do that. We have technology that allows us to map interventions into schedules so kids can go from one person to another when they need extra help. It's more, I think when you said community involvement, it would be more things like we've talked about in the past, competency-based credit, experiential learning activities, so that we're opening the opportunities that kids don't have to be in a classroom space. They can be doing a work experience. So that would be more what I'd be interested in. I don't think our administrators need help creating master schedules. We can create a schedule for a hybrid. We can create a schedule for in-person, and people will go, why didn't you do that before? And I think we've said that's because of the timing. But now when we have a launch, we can do that. So I think it's more about what are the experiences we can offer kids that are more than a traditional educational experience. And Siri, you've been advocating for this for years. This may be the opportunity to do that, where kids can connect with people in the workforce and actually learn about programming and learn about careers. And so that's where I would see more of the benefit of our community partnerships.
Absolutely. Looking more from a crisis solution sort of concept of putting forward in looking at ability to use technology in which to go forward with it. So thank you. Appreciate the difficulties in which to do so. So look forward to hearing more in regards to specifically the in-person. The other piece is, how will this actually be evaluated in thinking about our students having access to in-person who want to? That's the other piece that's unclear. What number are we expecting for this spring?
And I think we will gather that data through surveying our families to understand who is interested in in-person model and who's not. And so we'll have to ask our families for that.
So the plan is to outreach through a survey then?
We'll have to survey both our families and our staff around this as well.
And student.
Yes.
Director Blazner, anything else right now, or I'll move on to a question from another board member? Sorry, can you hear me?
That's fine, thank you.
Okay. Director Stewart, I saw, and then, okay.
A real quick question on equity hours. I think that's what you called. And you said that for some reason they weren't being utilized. Was it the lack of the students' knowledge, knowing that they could access these for equity? Was it, which side needed to have more information to make these things work? Was it the ability to recruit them? Was it the ability for, I don't think as a parent, many parents would probably have heard of them. I didn't, even as a board member, I don't recall them, but then again, my memory, who knows? But the point is, where did the ball get dropped? I mean,
yeah, I could speak to it maybe just from how it originated and what the intent was, and I think Matt can
Okay,
speak to it about how we're evaluating, as Siri was mentioning. So, again, we talk about bargaining, and I've heard different perspectives on that, but I have to say, as John was mentioning, our partnership with LWA let us say, and our teachers in all of our bargaining teams have always talked about serving their kids. And so one of the things that came out of our elementary bargaining is we know that some kids are not connecting as much as others. And we saw that when we were in the spring, and folks remember what that was like. So we need a resource that would allow us to do creative things, reach out to families, put an adult to connect with the kid. I think it's a function of having the idea and the implementation are two different things. And so the idea was good. The implementation is the question, like how do you use that resource? So basically it was a budget that was given to each school to creatively use the staff in their school to do outreach, to create more equitable experiences for their kids. I think Matt might be able to talk about some of the successes and then some of the things we're looking for that might use that same principle but do it more effectively.
Yeah, and this kind of gets on what I was talking a little bit around kind of the iteration or the benefit of looking as we phase things into test assumptions. And so our assumption was that having extra hours for staff to be able to intentionally create connections, provide supports, they were primarily delivering that through a remote environment. And so what our principals identified as they were putting that in place is that that it wasn't having the desired effect. They weren't actually connecting with the kids. So they had the resource. The intent was still good. It was it was just that it actually needed to really. They felt that it needed to be an in-person service, and so our principals brought that and said, hey, we would like to provide the service in person, but our current guidance isn't really clear on whether we can do that or not. So we reframed guidance to say, here's how you can provide in-person services for individuals or small groups. This is the resource that you already know that you have. And Dr. Holman earlier talked about the numbers of students, and they've been gradually expanding those. And in some sense, that work is also starting to kind of inform, I think, the models that are being looked at of how do we have an intervention-based model, because, these, whether it's, cohorts of, athletes or these small groups that we're providing services are providing examples of ways in which we can serve students that kind of creatively work around some of the barriers that we've run into. So it wasn't that, I would say they dropped the ball. It was just, there was an intent and it wasn't actually being realized. Principals quickly recognized that, raised the concern, and let us know what they needed in order to be able to.
I was just concerned that it was the idea that maybe the families weren't aware of them too, to be able to reach out to the principals, to the teachers, because if they don't know that it's available to them, it creates two streets to get that effort to go. And I thought that if we only have one street, then that's perhaps where it's not working. Okay, thank you.
Other questions from board members? I have it's a comment that I'm going to phrase as a question. Dr. Holman, in your initial Pathway Forward update to families on the 25th, I think that was the initial one, the model you put forward for support services suggested a series of more targeted opportunities for students. So certain groups of students would be targeted based on need. In your presentation your live video presentation, there's a bullet point that says any student that wants in-person experience is provided that opportunity. Which one is it? Is it going to be subsets of students, or is the goal to provide every student this year who wants to be in person an opportunity to do it?
So I believe I said that both in that letter and in the recorded message. And so the intent is to provide students with in-person experiences. To what degree we're able to provide that for every student, we can't say because we don't know every student that wants that yet. But it is critically important that we provide students the opportunity to be on campus with peers. And that's every student. And so is that a tall order? Absolutely, that's a tall order. But I believe we have the skills to be able to do that. Our building administrators are prepared to, because we're not gonna hand them a prepackaged, do this. It's really about, here are the parameters of work, and how do you then implement based on the needs of your students? How do you implement based on the opportunities that potentially you have had in place previously that you can model with this as well? And so it truly, that is the intent, yes.
Okay, excellent. And I just want to make sure I have this right. I mean, I understand that not every student will access in-person services under what we're seeking to do. But the goal is to provide, what we've heard from families tonight and every night and from the board is the option to be able to do it. And that is the goal. Do I have that right?
Correct.
Okay. Any other board member comments? Or, questions? Okay. Dr. Holman, is that I think we've concluded the presentation.
That concludes your superintendent's report.
Okay, excellent.